We are at a couple of minutes past midday, so I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're enjoying National Science Week, and I hope you're looking forward to today's Lunchbox Science. Any questions that you have, you can fill in through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we can then go through those questions at the end of the presentation. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge, perform an acknowledgement of country. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to the land, water and culture. I'm currently on Gweagal land. They're a Darawal speaking people. My respects to their elders, past, present, and of course emerging. And I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you're joining us from today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, this Lunchbox Science series has been a wonderful opportunity to gain knowledge from people at the very peak of their careers while you have a sandwich. We've had some great speakers from, Eddie Holmes and Mark Dadds, to my own colleague from the School of Chemistry, Alais, and today's speaker is no exception. So today we're going to hear from Professor David Alais. David is a professor of experimental psychology and a neuroscientist here at Sydney. And he runs a very busy research lab that investigates visual and sort of cross-modal perception. He's a Sydney graduate. And like many of us, when he completed his PhD, he then moved overseas, where he's worked in America, in France, in Italy. He's held fellowships from the Human Frontiers in Science program and the European Commission before he finally made his way back to Australia with the help of some fellowships from the ARC. So David is known for visual research, studying how the brain resolves ambiguous or conflicting inputs. And this includes pareidolia, which is why we see faces or other familiar things in our environment and in everyday objects. So I'm excited to find out about this topic, and I invite David to present today's Lunchbox lecture.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. That was a very, very kind introduction. Yes, so I'm delighted to be presenting as part of this Lunchbox Science series in conjunction with the National Science Week. And as Chris said, I'm actually talking about something called Paradolia. So the actual title of my talk is Faces in Clouds, Why Our Brains See Human Faces Everywhere. And you can see an example there of a cloud with apparently a face in it. I'd be interested to hear who you think it is. Most people that I've shown that to say, oh, it's Charles Darwin, but maybe you see something different. So we do see faces in clouds, and here's another example I just found on the internet, but you can see faces in all sorts of things. So here's a
Sorry to interrupt, David, but
yeah.
I am still seeing Lunchbox Science with Professor David Alais.
Okay, so still? Let me...
Oh,
is that better?
That is better. I can see what you're talking about now.
Okay, I don't know why that is, but we'll proceed like this, okay? So, okay, faces in clouds. There's that cloud I was talking about. So now you had time to imagine it. What does Charles Darwin look like in a cloud? That's what I was showing. But you can see faces in almost anything. So here is several examples. So we have a rather angry looking handbag. We have a very happy looking cheese grater and a kitchen mop, particularly stern looking kitchen mop, I would say. So they all seem strikingly face-like, and yet at the same time, they're obviously not faces. So, you know, why is that? That's what we're going to look at today, but it really is a thing, as they say these days. It's a thing, it's got a name, it's face pareidolia, and pretty much everybody gets it. So you could ask a few questions about about what this means, you might think, well, does that just mean we have vivid imaginations? Is it that things are ambiguous and we have a great ability to interpret them? Well, I'm going to tell you two main stories today about pareidolia. It reveals two really important things. One, the fundamental importance of faces to humans. And secondly, it reveals a lot about how the brain analyzes faces. Now, I couldn't resist a few more examples. So here are some faces in vegetables. On the left, that wonderful choco-looking thing. A really exquisite angry capsicum in the middle, complete with sort of baring its tonsils and its fangs and squinted eyes. That's amazing. And of course, that eggplant. You can even, if you follow things that trend on the internet, you may have seen the Jesus toast or the Mother Teresa cinnamon scroll. That Jesus toast, that's a real thing. A woman in South Carolina saw it and ended up selling it on eBay for quite a lot of money. So when your toast pops up, have a good look at it before buttering it. It may be worth something. So we can see faces in everything, it seems, but we can also see faces in faces, which is great because that's really the name of the game, because we are primates, we're very social creatures, and for us, faces are very important, right? Primates are social animals. We probably live in the most sophisticated, well, we do live in the most sophisticated societies of any animal. And so understanding faces and reading as much information from them is very, very important. So here's two happy primates sharing a joke on the left, and on the right, a sort of more typical human scene. We have two people locked eye to eye looking at each other and reading each other's faces for information. The other thing that's interesting about this picture is as well as the face giving us a whole lot of information around identity, who is it, what's their age, sex, emotion, right? That sort of thing. Even their intentions, are they friend or foe? Are they going to help us or hurt us, right? Indeed, what's their state of health? Do they look healthy or do they look sort of feverish? And all sorts of things through evolution are really important that we can extract from faces. And one of those things is gaze, which is just the direction of where the eyes are looking. And the other two people in this talk are looking down at that iPad. And it turns out we also have a very exquisite ability when we're talking face to face with someone, when their eyes deviate, to project exactly where in space those people are looking. Gaze is a very important thing too that comes out of faces. But we're primates and faces are very, very important to us. We probably see more faces than any other visual stimulus. You know, you see a lot of coffee cups in the day. You might see a lot of cars. You might see a lot of trees, a lot of telephones. I don't know, but you probably spend more time looking at and interacting with faces than anything else. And it makes you a bit of a face expert through all that experience. So on this slide, we have nearly 2,000 faces packed in there. And you'd be surprised to learn that the average person can easily know, remember the identity of at least these 2,000 faces. Most people can perceive a lot more than that, or remember a lot more than that. One study estimated that people can remember 5,000 unique identities. Now, and good rememberers up to about 10,000. That's probably an underestimate because it's actually very hard to do this experiment. I mean, how would you do it? Would you take a subject and say, right, I need 10,000 friends of you know, acquaintances and everybody you've crossed paths with over the years so that you can test them? That would never work. So in fact, what they did to arrive at this figure of 5,000 for the average person is to use celebrities. So people that we should be familiar with, all of us. So they compiled a massive list of celebrities. I think to get 10,000, they exhausted the A list and probably went through B and C and D as well. But eventually, by presenting familiar faces, people would say, oh, I recognize that person. They're in a movie, or they're a sports star, or they're on TV. And yeah, on average, you can distinguish 5,000 faces. So that makes you a face expert. Now, expertise is not that uncommon, of course. You might look at that vase on the left and say, oh, that's a Ming Dynasty vase. Maybe you're a real expert and you say it's from the Yongle period, you know, approximately 1410 Maybe you're into birds. Maybe you're a car specialist and you know that that's a 6-speed V12 car, right? So it is possible to acquire expertise in all sorts of things. But the thing with faces is that it's effortless. So you become a face expert with no effort whatsoever. And that makes it unique. You can easily tell, for example, that these two different people, although they look very similar, are clearly different people. So we're on the one hand face experts, on the other hand, we achieve that effortlessly. So there's a mystery. How does that happen? Well, the answer is that the brain has an app for that, so to speak. There is specialized brain areas dedicated to processing faces. And here you can see a picture of the brain, so sort of slightly stylized, but that's a brain scan from an MRI scan, a functional scan. So it shows hotspots of activity where different parts of the brain are active when they see certain kinds of images. And there's 3 clusters there. The occipital face area, which is very important for recognizing parts in the face and how they're configured. That's the fusiform face area. You've got an occipital face area as well, OFA, and a superior temporal sulcus that does lots of things, actually, including some multisensory perception, but it's involved in face dynamics and lip reading and things like that. So we have this network of 3 areas that contribute to our ability to be specialists in faces. So a question that arises is face expertise innate? Well, yes and no, more no than yes. We can say, though, that newborns prefer to look at a face over other objects. So given the choice, they will orient towards a face. And so there's some inbuilt preference there very early on. That's interesting that they orient to faces, because as you can see from that image on the left, a face to a newborn is just a blur, right? For newborns, well, they're not quite blind, like kittens are blind when they're born, but they really don't see very well at all. And in fact, they have a level of vision that would be considered legally blind, right, at birth. So when the newborn's looking at its mother, it basically just sees a blurry face, and the only things that stand out are 2 eyes and a mouth, maybe a nose, but always there's a certain darkness around the 2 eyes and the mouth. And that becomes an important template in faces, because that essentially describes a smiley face, right? The classic smiley face that communicates immediately to us, the presence of a face. It's 2 eyes and a mouth. And that's really all the newborn is seeing. But that's also what a face is. So when you're scanning the environment, looking at the world, you can easily lock onto a face because it will always fit that sort of template of 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. So is it innate, this basic tendency to prefer that configuration of the smiley face is innate, but all that expertise is learned through experience, which also has some consequences, as we'll see later. Well, in fact, now. So one of the things it means is that our visual areas that are sensitive to faces are tuned up to the prevailing input, which of course is upright faces. And so we become very experienced and very skillful at recognizing faces, and yet they're very hard to identify upside down. It's exactly the same object, it's just inverted. But that's not the way these brain areas that I mentioned were trained. They were trained on upright faces. So who can you recognize in this slide? It's not very easy. And yet if I flip it over, you'll find that it's actually pretty easy. We seem to have, if I'm not mistaken, Oprah Winfrey on the top, Ronald Reagan on the bottom left, middle bottom, I think, is Ellen DeGeneres. That's Morgan Freeman, the actor, bottom right, and looks like Meryl Streep, top right. I am at a loss to identify the person in the middle at the top, but at least I can get 5 of them. And when they were upside down, I couldn't get any of them. So that's just reflecting the brain is tuned up and highly trained to upright faces, which is the input that it's developing in response to. Now, all faces have this basic configuration of 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. So faces are just objects, like lots of other objects in the world, and yet objects can take on all sorts of diverse forms, whereas a face always has a standard form. It's always these 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. And so to some extent, the whole thing gets processed globally. If those boxes get ticked, yes, it satisfies that basic face template of eyes, nose, mouth, then it's sort of processed as a whole. And in doing so, you lose the ability to accurately discriminate amongst the elements. And so here's a face. It's actually, I don't know if you can tell who it is. It's sort of on the top resembles George Clooney, but I'm not sure. The bottom doesn't seem to be a match there. If I split them in half, you can see that actually what that was a composite face. It was George Clooney on the top, and it was Harrison Ford on the bottom. When I break the global configuration, the tendency to want to integrate all that into a single pattern, right, by now shearing them sideways, now you can look at each half in turn, and it's pretty clear the bottom is Harrison Ford, if you know your movie stars, and the top's George Clooney. But when they were together, it was a lot harder. So that's global processing. It sort of inhibits your ability to detect local elements. If a face is present in the environment, it's detected very quickly and very efficiently. So if you look through this list of objects here, and I say, okay, search for the animal as quickly as you can, well, you'll look at all the images, and eventually you'll say, oh yes, there is a sort of an animal down there on the bottom right. That's the animal. So you find that. It might take you 5 or 10 seconds. On the next slide, I can show you an array of objects that has a face in it, and the face will be much quicker to detect. There, you've got it already, I'm sure. So the face is, oh my goodness, excuse me. So the face is detected very quickly because the brain, it is such an important stimulus for us. As I said, it's important for our, survival really as a social species. So we've evolved this way to detect them very fast and very efficiently. And that means detecting it without really thinking about it. If you had to think and evaluate whether every input was a face or not, that'd be way too slow. Just having this sort of global template that can be applied automatically without any sort of cognitive effort is a very fast and efficient way to lock onto objects that are probably faces in the world. And that's why it pops out so fast here. So you can detect the presence of a face very, very fast. But of course, you want to know who it is. So how do you detect face identity? Now, you might think, oh, faces could be stored as images in your memory. And when you see a face, then you can just go through all the images in memory and try and find the match. That would be way, way too slow and use way too much memory. You know, from your computer or your telephone, they can actually fill up. You sometimes run out of memory space and you can't take more photographs on your phone. That's because the computer or the phone is saving the full image. Now, even an image, these are quite small images on the screen. They might be 100 by 100 pixels, but that's still a total of 10,000 pixels per image to encode, and that's a lot of information and way too much for the brain to encode. So it's come up with a method that's a whole lot more economical than that. So I said all faces are the same in a broad global configuration sense, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. So really, they're all just variations on the same theme. So what you do then is to know someone's identity, you have a few landmark features that you can measure on the face, and the distances between those features will be unique for everybody. Somebody might have their eyebrows much higher up than another person. There might be a big gap between their nose and their top lip, or a big gap down to the tip of the jaw. You can put landmarks on the face, and if you have just several dimensions of these, it's pretty much the case that everybody will have some unique combination of inter-feature differences. So on the right, I'm showing the nose. If you think about it, just the nose is already a lot of information. You have the width at the bottom of the nose, the width at the bridge of the nose, the size of the sort of area of the tip. In profile too, you've got the angle of the nose and so forth. Just with the nose, there's several dimensions that might distinguish you from someone else. And this approach is very economical. So basically, instead of having to lay down a memory of the entire image, you just need to keep track of a number of values that indicate differences between features. So it's not so much image encoding, it's just a pattern recognition process that's going on, much more economical. And it's also the approach that artificial intelligence uses to identify faces. So for example, if you have an iPhone with face recognition to unlock it, it uses a number of these landmark points. It actually also cleverly maps them onto a 3D model so that it can see you. If you're not quite facing directly the camera, it can still work out who you are. And apparently there's about a 1 in a million chance of someone else's face unlocking your phone. So it's pretty effective approach. It's what AI uses, and it appears to be what the human brain uses. And there appears to be neurons in this area FFA that are sensitive along dimensions of distance between features. You can also, this is how they animate things like this as well. This is an example of faces with a whole bunch of landmarks. So if you're animating or doing some kind of face recognition thing for dynamic faces, you can just keep track of them over time. So differences, but now differences over time. And so you get this kind of mesh structure that's just all those links between face features, and keeping track of those is what is determining identity. And it's a very economical way to do it. So here's a face, and here I've sketched in some data on the right there in those little blue squares. So let's imagine there's just 12 locations on the face. Let's keep it. Now, the computers use, a lot of systems use 68 facial locations, and then there's some that use a lot more than that, okay? I guess the computers can do it. They have the overhead, the power to crunch all those numbers. The brain seems to do it a bit more economically, but let's imagine there's just 12 locations on the face, and the distance between each feature can take one of 6 levels. So that would give you enough unique combinations for nearly 3 million people. And I worked out that that would mean you could meet 80 unique faces every day of your life for 100 years and only just reach 2.9 million. So, you know, you don't need many face features and levels of distance between them to cover a whole lot of possibilities. So here's a person, they might have a distribution. There's 12 columns of data there I'm showing, each with 6 levels. Okay, so this person might have that sort of distribution, and they have a different identity to the next person because the next person I'm going to show you has a different pattern of data, a different pattern of differences between these landmark features. And the next person, again, a different pattern. And that doesn't look like a lot of potential data values, but it adds up to an enormous number of combinations. And so you can see how we can easily encode 5,000 unique people, as that study I mentioned earlier. You can see how we can easily encode 5,000 identities, and quite economically, without remembering massive images, just essentially data and looking for patterns when we analyze a face. So something else I'd like to tell you is that expression. So we look at a face. So first of all, we said we detect faces very, very fast. And then I explained that we can work out their identity by looking at the distances between features. So face expression is also another thing. So here's a well-known figure presented upside down. You can probably see that it's President Obama. But what this demonstration is going to show you is that face expression also requires careful analysis of distance between features. So when you smile, the corners of your mouth rise up, and your eyes might squint, and whatever. There's all sorts of relations between landmarks that determine expression as well. I also mentioned before that most of what we've learned about faces in our face expertise is acquired for upright faces. This demonstration shows that we really can't analyze the expression of a face when it's upside down. We're just not trained for that. So now I'm going to flip exactly the same images upright again, and you'll notice something very strange. The image on the left has an absolutely grotesque expression, right? You did recognize that it was Obama when it was upside down, but you had no insight that his expression was so grotesque. What's happened here is we've doctored the images so that the mouth has been turned upside down and the eyes have been rotated upside down as well. Creates a very unusual and grotesque expression, but I go back to the inverted images and it just wasn't obvious. Now, maybe now you can very carefully compare the left and right images and say, oh, and now I see the face is upside down. But it's staggering that you didn't notice that first time when it was clearly such a grotesque expression. So this system, and it applies to face identification as well as face expression, it relies on distances between face features, and that is something that's you've learned for upright faces, so you have a poor ability to identify people and their expressions when they're upside down. The good thing about having this system of just keeping track of distances is that it's very robust over different contexts. So here's what have we got? 12 faces, and I could ask you how many identities do you see in there? So scan the faces and work out how many different identities do you see? Well, if you're a good face person, you've noticed that they're all the same. And yet the conditions of each face are very, very different. So down at the bottom right, the guy's got his head tilted. And the bottom left, it's a much bigger image than, say, the 1 second left on the bottom. There are examples there where you can see the eye color. Look at the top right. It's clear that we've got some blue eyes there, but you can't rely on that because in a lot of these images, eye color is not visible. So what is visible, what is reliable, even though the lighting conditions and the size of the image near or far might change, what's reliable is that there's a constant ratio of distances between the features. And so if you use that to work out identity, then you realize, oh, this is all the same person. It's just the lighting conditions and the hair and a few things have changed. You can do this in the lab. You can get people, you can organize faces like this as a set of almost like playing cards, and you can say, just deal these into distinct piles for each identity that you see. And if you're good at face discrimination, and most of us are, you would quickly work out that all these cards can be sorted into 2 piles. There really is only 2 identities in this array of images. There's 40 images there, but only 2 identities. And particularly if you had some familiarity with the person, you would do that very easily. It might be harder for a face you're not familiar with, but if it's learned and it's in there, the unique combinations that I was talking about, then you would quickly extract the people from that image that there's really only 2 identities. So I did mention that artificial intelligence uses the same sort of distance between features trick to identify people. If you're interested, there's actually some websites you can visit where you can do this. So there is a website called twinstrangers.net where you can find your doppelganger. Now, a doppelganger, as you know, is a lookalike, your double. Now, it makes sense. There is a small probability that there is a person somewhere in the world that looks just like you. And so if you go to twinstrangers.net, you put in a photo of yourself, and it's going to make all those measurements between the eyes, the mouth, the chin, and everything, search through its database and find faces that look just like you. So these are my top 6 matches on the right. I guess they kind of look like me, although I feel pretty strongly they don't, but you know, maybe that's just me. So I tried something else. There's another website you might try. Instead of just being anybody, it searches only amongst celebrities. I thought, oh, this could be fun. So this website is starbyface.com. And again, you put in your photograph and it's going to trawl through and find the identities of people most like you, except they're celebrities. So I did this. I was a little disappointed with the output, partly because I actually don't know who any of them are, except the black and white photo is Jack Nicholson, who I know from movies like Easy Rider 1969, that came out, showing my age, and The Shining. These other guys, I've got no idea who they are, although I do feel this algorithm came closer. The top row is probably closer to matching me than the other one. But anyway, I suggest you have a try at that. That was twinstrangers.net and starbyface.net. I thought I'd have some fun and put in some other well-known faces and see what came out. So here's Scott Morrison. I put him into twin strangers looking for doppelgangers, and these were his top 6 matches. And then to be politically balanced, I decided I should put in Albanese as well, and out came his top 6 matches. Now, you might say none of these really look like him, but remember that what it's really doing is applying an algorithm where it looks for similar relationships between key features. And if you take this chap, for instance, on the top right with the blue background there, he looks very different to Albo, and yet looking at the eyes and the nose, there is a distinct similarity. So you can see it's very similar from what I can see. So even though the rest of the face is quite different, some of those key features, the algorithm certainly has picked up on those distances, and you know, it is a reasonable match in that sense. So here's an interesting thing. I want to show you a video now of what happens when you stimulate brain cells in this area, in this fusiform face area that you see on the bottom of that diagram. When you see a face and you're recognizing that face, there are cells in these face selective areas that are firing, and particular cells are firing. If your eyes are close together, then the cells that code a small distance for eye separation are firing. If you have eyes far apart, different cells that respond to that big distance are firing. So, okay, that's what we think's going on. So what would happen if we could electrically stimulate cells in FFA? I'm going to show you a movie now of exactly this happening. So I'm going to show you.
Just look at my face and tell.
First of all, this is a patient in hospital. There's a whole lot of bandaging on the top because he's had a big chunk of his cranium removed and a massive gang of electrodes inserted into the brain. This happens sometimes for people who have very severe epilepsy. Sometimes they do some surgery to try and alleviate that. And as part of that, they implant a whole lot of electrodes in the brain to record brain activity. And they try to find out which part of the brain had the irregular activity that's causing the seizures. So you spend some time in hospital with 100 or more electrodes in your brain while they're being recorded to try and identify the anomaly. While you've got the electrodes in your brain, you can be totally awake and conscious and talking, right? There's no, pain receptors in the brain or anything. So you don't feel anything. It's just you're awake and you just happen to have these electrodes in there. So this guy is going to be, have the electrodes in his temporal cortex where that face selective area is. We're going to stimulate those and see what happens to his face perception.
What happens when I do this, all right? 1, 2, 3. Nothing.
Okay, nothing happened there because just to check that the patient's not making this up, they sometimes click the switch and they don't deliver electricity, and then the correct answer would be nothing happened. Other times they click the switch and they do deliver electricity. So that's just a good check to make sure he's not inventing things. The next trial, they electrically stimulate the electrodes in his temporal cortex.
Okay. I'm going to do it one more time. Look at my face. 1, 2, 3.
You just turned into somebody else.
Tell me
Your
about
face metamorphosed. Your nose got saggy, went to the left. You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different. That was a trip.
Could you see my eyes in place?
I could see your eyes, but you could have been somebody else who had, well, he has similar eyes to Dr. Pareidolia, but you were someone else. Your whole face just sort of metamorphosed.
Did it get warped?
Yes.
Did it keep its own features?
No, it's almost like the shape of your face, your features drooped. Yeah, sort of like they drooped to a particular direction, kind of stretched and drooped.
So that's an amazing report, because while this guy was getting his temporal lobe stimulated, the rest of his vision was fine. There was nothing wrong with his vision. And in fact, there was nothing wrong with his perception of the face. He was still seeing the face. It didn't go all noisy or fuzzy or whatever. Exactly what happened was exactly what you would predict. He's looking at the Dr. Parvizi, and certain cells are active, encoding the spatial relations of the key features. And then you activate new cells with these new electrodes. So suddenly the spacing shifts, and literally before our eyes, the guy says, yeah, well, the eyes spread out and the nose went down here. So this is exactly the sort of thing you would predict if cells in the fusiform face area were encoding these distances between features. You activate different cells and suddenly your perception shifts to reflect that new activity. So that's a great insight, that one that confirms what we think we know about how all this is done in the brain. Now, how good are you with faces? You know, some people say, oh, I'm not very good with faces. Others might say, well, I never forget a face. I forget the names, but I do recognize them. Some people just don't recognize faces at all. Now, I have a hunch that I'm not particularly good at face recognition, although it's not too bad, but I've always thought it's not as good as it could be. So I was motivated to try the Cambridge face memory test. Now, you can do this online. It takes 10 minutes, maybe 12 at the most. And it's kind of interesting to do. And it works like this. They will, first of all, as you see on the left, give you a face to memorize. And having memorized it, that goes blank. And then a test screen comes up with 3 faces on it, which I'm showing on the right. And you press button 1, 2, or 3 to indicate which person you had just committed to memory. And of course, the answer here is number 3. So I got that one right. So I did this test, and I recommend you try it out. If you can't get all of that URL address down, just remember Cambridge Face Memory Test. You can find it online. So here are my results. I was pretty excited because in bold type, it says your accuracy was 72%. Now at university, that's not a bad score. That's a credit. So I was kind of happy with that. The details here in the fine print, the average score on this test is around 80%. So I'm below average. In fact, if I was at 60% or below, it would indicate face blindness. Oh my goodness. So I really aren't that good at this. I'm sort of below average. But you know, that's kind of normal in the sense that across the whole population, like so many things in psychology, so many attributes, there's what they call the bell curve distribution, you know, where most of us are clustered in the middle. And in this case, it's at about 80%. There are some that are really good at the high end towards 100 and some that drop down towards 60. So I guess I'm kind of roughly in the middle of that bell curve shape, but everyone's going to be different on this task. And it's something fun you can try out for yourself. Some people are super identifiers and will get 100% on this test. But there are those that won't do so well on it. There's actually a thing called prosopagnosia, which is face blindness. And face blindness is interesting because your vision's completely normal in all respects. It's not like you have, you know, blind spots or anything that where you can't see. You have perfectly normal vision in all respects, except that when you look at a face to you is not particularly special. You don't have that expertise that we've all developed. It's a face is like an object, just like any other object, and we're not super expert at discriminating other objects. And if the face is just like another, you're not very good at discriminating identities or emotions in faces. Now, it's interesting. It usually happens because there's damage to that area in the image. You can see there the FFA, that fusiform face area, that's really centrally involved in your perception of identity in a face, right? And maybe 1 in 50 people, something like that, have prosopagnosia. It can be something congenital, that is you know, just developmentally, that expertise never develops for some reason. That seems to be the bulk of it. It can also happen if there's some sort of accident or trauma to the head that might cause a lesion of just that part of the brain, then you might also acquire prosopagnosia that way. You cannot identify the face. You certainly see it. You see that there's 2 eyes, you see that there's a nose and a mouth, but you're not doing all that fine encoding of the spacing and the distances to extract identity and expression and all those sorts of things. And so remembering faces becomes very difficult. So you have to remember things like, oh, Susan, she has the tortoiseshell glasses and the hair in the ponytail, whereas Peter has got the shaved head with the mohawk and the beard. Like you use other things, non-facial things, to remember who people are. And of course, that's a problem because all those extras can change, whereas, you know, the distribution of face features doesn't change. We saw before how constant that is. So look, back to where we started, we talked about faces in clouds as a way into pareidolia. So pareidolia is this thing where you see objects that are clearly not faces as being face-like. So we have here the angry typewriter, the happy aeroplane, the angry, grumpy handbag. So what explains pareidolia? I asked at the beginning, is it just our imaginations going wild? Or is it something more fundamental and basic? So 2 of my former PhD students, Susan Wardle and Jessica Torbett, after they finished at Sydney, went off to do great things in the United States. And one of the things they did was to scan human brains while they looked at pareidolia images. So this only came out recently, last year. What you can see in that image on the right is the 2 hemispheres of the brain. Now, actually, we're looking up from the bottom, okay? So the brain's not in this classical sort of configuration. We're looking up at the bottom because that FFA is kind of at the bottom under here. And you can see they're marked there in purple and green, the occipital face area in green, the fusiform face area in purple. And when people are looking at pareidolia images, does the face area light up? It sure does. You can see the activity there very clearly in particularly fusiform face area. So we've already seen that looking for a face is very fast amongst a clutter of objects. So we detect them super fast. And then this shows that actually your face sensitive areas in the brain are responding to pareidolia images. And that's really why they look so compellingly face-like. It is really driving your brain's hardware in the same way that a real face would. And why? I mean, they're clearly not faces, and yet, as I'm showing there with that smiley face, they do satisfy that basic face template, that basic global configuration that seems to trigger detection of the faces. Something else that we did, my 2 former students and I, sorry this is such a busy slide, we wanted to look at not just detecting pareidolia faces, but what about the emotion in them? They seem to be strikingly emotional, don't they? Like that green fella there, or the handbag, they have a very striking emotion. So is that something we project onto it, or is that also something real and low level encoded in the brain? So there's a serial bias that happens. You may not know this, but looking across that top line for the faces, if you play a sequence of faces and have to judge how happy or angry each face is, there's a bit of a carryover from the previous image. So this kid, little blonde kid at the top's pretty angry, but he followed just after a happy face, and that will bias the angry face up towards being happy. There's a carryover from the previous. And as the sequence continues, the young woman in third position, she's also looking happy, but you would rate her as less happy because you've just seen an angry face. So there's this sort of one back carryover that biases your current perception. It's well known to occur in faces. We checked if it would occur in pareidolia too. So in the middle row, there's happy, angry, pareidolia images. And when people rated their expression on scales from happy to angry, we got the same serial bias. So it occurs for pareidolia as well as faces. But in the clinching experiment, we mixed them all together, pareidolia interleaved with real faces. And if it's all going through a common neural mechanism that's causing this carryover effect, then you should also get this serial bias when you mix categories together. And indeed we did. And so it looks like faces and pareidolia share not just this initial detection in the face system, we go on and process them for emotion as well. It's almost like the brain doesn't know it's made a mistake, and that's not really a face. It detects it, processes it, extracts emotion, just like it does for real faces. So to wrap up then, a few takeaways. So I've told you that face expertise is vital for survival, and we've evolved some neural hardware to take care of that. We're the most sophisticated social species, so faces are absolutely important. We have these face specialized modules that make us experts. The expertise is largely acquired through experience, so you get those weird inversion effects because we're not trained on inverted faces. We detect super fast and effectively faces and rarely miss one because we basically apply that simple face template approach. That's great for never missing a face, but it leads to the occasional false positive such as pareidolia. So that's really why we see faces in clouds. Thank you for your attention, and I believe we have time for questions and answers. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, David. That was very interesting, and I can't wait to sort of test my my face recognition skills. I'm not sure if I want to know, but yeah, I'm going to give that a go after this talk. But yeah, it was very intriguing. We have a couple of questions here. I think I'll firstly start with, we've got a question here about, would your identical twin be able to unlock your iPhone?
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so because, yeah, that is a trap. If you are an identical twin, be careful. Someone can go through your phone. Because if, you know, Apple estimates that it's an effective technology with about 1 in a million chance of being opened by someone else. Now, I would say that there's, yeah, if you're identical, it's going to be, you're going to be one of those 1 in a million for sure, no doubt.
Yeah, so yeah, not looking good. Okay, we've got another question here. When you say 2% of the population has prosopagnosia, I probably said that wrong, are they all the same? There are many people who say, I am bad at remembering faces. They are not considered patients, but still must have some gradient. So there must be a massive number of people suffering from some amount of face recognition problem. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. That's certainly the case. So there would be a range of people, so a whole continuum. There are super recognizers who can recognize any face under any condition, just about any sort of lighting condition or whatever. They sometimes get used as forensic experts in court cases. They can identify anybody with very high accuracy. They're at one end. At the other end, there's people who are below average. So I'm one of those. And that continuum just extends to a point where you become classified as prosopagnosic. But of course, we're just drawing a line there at some point on what's a continuum and saying, well, if you're on the other side, then you have a kind of face blindness. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a really big problem, but you need to become very skilled at using other information to remember who someone is. And of course, you know, those slides I showed you of the, I don't know if you can still see them, of the face recognition test, they mask off the hair and the ears and everything. So it's just the facial features. it's quite hard to identify people just like that. But of course, in the real world, there's hair and there's ears and all sorts of things that help you to know who it is. And memory, human memory in general, relies a lot on context. So yeah, it doesn't have to be debilitating, but it certainly means you're less good at recognizing people.
We have another one here. Is it prosopagnosia, the wrong name? They are not blind for face. They see faces, just don't know who it belongs to.
Yeah, that's true. It is a slight misnomer. You're right there, because, you know, as I said, the people see the face. They look at. They have no trouble recognizing that something's there. They can even recognize all the elements of the face. It's just that what face expertise really is the relationships between all of those features, and it's that expertise that they don't have. They're not blind in any sense that they can't see. They see all those elements, but the brain is not extracting those differences between distances between elements. So yeah, it is a slight misnomer. They are certainly not blind in any standard way of thinking about it.
And do people with prosopagnosia experience face pareidolia, or do they see the images in isolation?
Right. So that's to be determined experimentally. It hasn't been done, but I would very strongly predict that they would not perceive pareidolia, because pareidolia occurs because you essentially see a match to that sort of global face template that I've been talking about, and that automatically triggers the face processing. So you go, wow, that's really face-like. And as I said, you then go on and extract the emotion. You think, wow, it's not just face-like, it's happy or it's angry. I suspect if they're not having, if they can't trigger that FFA activity, they're not going to perceive pareidolia. So yeah, that might be a test as well for face blindness, if you just don't see pareidolia in images.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so do we apply the same principles of facial recognition to animals?
Other animals do, to their same kind animals. We no. So you could become an expert at cats or dogs or cows or sheep, but it would be like becoming the antique expert with the Chinese vases or the bird expert. You would have to, in a really effortful, deliberate way, train yourself up on lots of observations of vases or birds or faces in this case, or animal faces, you're saying. Yeah, you could, but you'd have to do it the hard way, and you could become an expert. So my point is that we have this sort of predisposed brain area that's all configured to train up automatically with exposure to faces as input. You could acquire the same expertise if you studied, say, cat faces enough. Yeah,
Makes sense. Okay, I think we'll have a last question, and it's quite what's happening right now, so quite appropriate. Do you think mask wearing could impact development in young children in the face recognizing brain areas?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd say yes and no. I'd say yes for the following reason. I did say in the talk that the brain uses distances between face features to recognize identity and also emotional expression. I did mention that telephones and other artificial devices use the same trick to work out who they're looking at. Now, as you know, if you've got an iPhone with Face ID, when you've got the mask on, I can't recognize you. So if that's enough to fool the artificial intelligence, it must be enough to fool the brain to some extent. And so, yeah, it would impact on, it would certainly impact on immediate identification of who that is and what is their expression, no doubt, because you're missing half the features. Whether it's got a long-term developmental impact, well, I guess if for an extended period all you saw was masked faces, then it would. So yeah, it would have an immediate impact. I suspect we've probably seen enough faces already to have tuned up that system in our brains. But you open up the possibility with your question, yes, if we were masked for the next 10 years, well, certainly there'd be a generation of kids growing up with very poor face recognition and expression identification. Yeah, good point.